Lady Bela Ashcroft had always known that her beauty was both her greatest asset and her most dangerous weapon. But as she plummeted through the darkness from the tower window of Ashcroft Manor on what should have been the most triumphant night of her life, she realized that someone had decided her beauty and her betrothal posed too great a threat to allow her to live. The wind tore at her gown as she fell toward certain death, her mind racing not with fear, but with the burning question of who among her supposed loved ones had wanted her dead. Then strong arms caught her from the darkness, and she found herself staring into the steel-grey eyes of Duke Edward Kensington, a man who had just saved her life and unknowingly bound their fates together forever. In that moment, suspended between death and salvation, Bella understood that her real story was just beginning. The ancient stones of Ashcroft Manor had witnessed 3 centuries of family celebrations, but none quite so elaborate as the betrothal feast being held on this crisp October evening in 1825. Lady Bela Ashcroft stood before her dressing mirror, allowing her lady's maid to make final adjustments to her gown of midnight blue silk, adorned with sapphires that caught the candlelight like captured stars. At 22, Bella possessed the kind of beauty that inspired poets and launched wars: raven black hair that fell in lustrous waves to her waist, violet eyes framed by impossibly long lashes, and features so perfectly sculpted they seemed carved from marble by a master artist. Her beauty had been her family's salvation, securing a betrothal to Lord Reginald Worthington that would restore the Ashcroft fortune and elevate their social standing. "You look magnificent, my lady," whispered Margaret, her maid, as she fastened the sapphire necklace that had belonged to Bella's grandmother. "Lord Worthington will be speechless when he sees you." "Let us hope so," Bella replied, though her reflection showed none of the joy one might expect from a newly betrothed woman. The arrangement with Worthington was advantageous, certainly, but it was also cold and calculating, a business transaction disguised as romance. "My lady," Margaret continued hesitantly, "forgive me for speaking out of turn, but you seem troubled. Are you having second thoughts about the betrothal?" Bella considered the question carefully. "Not second thoughts, precisely, but I cannot shake the feeling that something is wrong. There have been too many whispered conversations that stop when I enter a room, too many meaningful glances exchanged between family members." "Perhaps they're simply planning a surprise for the celebration," Margaret suggested hopefully. "Perhaps," Bella agreed, though her instincts told her otherwise. She had always been perceptive, able to read the undercurrents of emotion and intention that others missed. Tonight, those currents felt dangerous. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Her stepmother, Lady Catherine Ashcroft, swept into the room wearing an elaborate gown of burgundy velvet that emphasized her still striking beauty despite her 45 years. Catherine had married Bela's father when Bela was only 10, and their relationship had always been cordial but distant. "Bela, darling, you look absolutely radiant," Catherine said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "The guests are beginning to arrive, and your father is eager to present you to Lord Worthington's family." "Of course," Bela replied, rising gracefully from her chair. "I wouldn't want to keep anyone waiting." "Before we go down," Catherine said, her voice taking on an oddly urgent tone, "I wanted to speak with you privately about certain matters that will be expected of you as a married woman." Bela raised an eyebrow. "Surely such a conversation could wait until after the celebration." "I'm afraid not," Catherine insisted. "There are things you need to understand before you make your formal commitment tonight. Things about the Ashcroft family history that, well, that might affect your future." Something in her stepmother's tone made Bela's skin prickle with unease. "What sort of things?" "It would be better if I showed you," Catherine said, moving toward the door. "There are documents in the tower room, papers that belong to your mother. Your father has been reluctant to share them with you, but I believe you have a right to know the truth before you marry." Bella felt a chill run down her spine. Her mother had died when she was very young, and her father had always been evasive about the circumstances. "What truth?" "Come with me, and I'll explain everything," Catherine said, her hand already on the door handle. "But we must hurry. The ceremony is set to begin within the hour." Against her better judgment, Bella followed her stepmother through the winding corridors of the manor toward the ancient tower that housed the family's oldest records. The tower had always been off limits to her as a child, and she had never questioned why until now. "Catherine," she said as they climbed the narrow stone steps, "why are you telling me this now? Why tonight?" Because after tonight it will be too late, Catherine replied cryptically. Once you're married to Worthington, certain arrangements will be set in motion that cannot be undone. They reached the top of the tower, where a heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar. Catherine pushed it open to reveal a circular room lined with ancient books and documents illuminated by a single candle that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. "The papers are in that chest," Catherine said, pointing to an ornate wooden box on a table near the window. "Your mother's final letter to you, explaining everything." Bella moved toward the chest with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She had always wondered about her mother, had always felt that there were secrets surrounding her death. Perhaps finally she would have answers. But as she reached for the chest, she heard the door slam shut behind her. She spun around to find Catherine standing with her back against the door, her face transformed by an expression of cold calculation that Bella had never seen before. "Catherine, what's happening? Why did you close the door?" "Because, my dear stepdaughter," Catherine said, her voice now devoid of any maternal warmth, "you have become a problem that needs to be solved." Bella felt ice form in her veins. "What do you mean?" "I mean that your betrothal to Worthington threatens everything I've worked for these past 12 years, Catherine said, beginning to pace the small room like a predator circling its prey. "Do you have any idea how carefully I've positioned myself in this family? How much I've sacrificed to ensure my own son's inheritance?" "Your son," Bella repeated, confused. "But you have no children, don't I?" Catherine smiled, and it was the most chilling expression Bella had ever seen. "My son Richard has been living abroad, being educated in preparation for the day when he would claim his rightful place as heir to the Ashcroft fortune, but your marriage to Worthington would complicate that considerably." "I don't understand," Bella said, though she was beginning to piece together the horrifying truth. "My father's will leaves everything to you as his only legitimate child," Catherine finished. "But if something were to happen to you before you marry and produce an heir, the estate would pass to the next male relative, which, through a carefully constructed family tree, happens to be my son." Bella backed toward the window, her mind racing. "You're talking about murder." "I'm talking about necessity," Catherine corrected. "You see, my dear, your father has been ill for some time, much more ill than he's let on. The physicians give him perhaps 6 months to live. If you marry Worthington and produce a child, that child would inherit everything. But if you were to meet with an unfortunate accident before the marriage—" "You're insane," Bella whispered. "I'm practical," Catherine replied, "and I'm afraid your time has run out." Before Bella could react, Catherine lunged forward, grabbing her by the shoulders and pushing her toward the open window. Bella fought back, but Catherine was stronger than she appeared, driven by desperation and years of careful planning. "It will look like suicide," Catherine panted as they struggled. "The pressure of the betrothal, the weight of family expectations, everyone will understand why you couldn't bear it." Bella managed to break free for a moment, but Catherine caught her again, this time with a grip that brooked no escape. As she felt herself being forced toward the window, Bella's mind flashed through her life. The lonely childhood, the distant father, the stepmother who had never truly loved her. Was this really how it would end? "Goodbye, Bella," Catherine said, and with a final violent shove, sent her tumbling through the window into the darkness below. The fall seemed to last forever. Bella felt the wind tearing at her gown, heard the rush of air past her ears, saw the ground rushing up to meet her. In those final moments, she felt not fear, but a strange sense of clarity. She understood now why her instincts had been screaming warnings all evening. But just as she braced herself for impact, strong arms caught her, breaking her fall and pulling her against a solid chest. She found herself staring up into the most remarkable pair of steel-grey eyes she had ever seen, set in a face of such masculine beauty that for a moment she wondered if she had died and was looking upon an angel. "Are you hurt?" the man asked, his voice deep and cultured, tinged with concern and something else, anger perhaps, at whoever had put her in such danger. I don't think so," Bella managed, though she was shaking so violently she could barely speak. "You caught me." "Indeed I did," he said, and she could hear the grim satisfaction in his voice, "though I suspect that wasn't part of someone's plan." "You saw what happened?" Bella asked, hope flaring in her chest. "I saw enough," he replied grimly. "I saw a woman being pushed from a tower window by someone who clearly wanted her dead. The question is, who wanted Lady Bella Ashcroft murdered, and why?" Bella stared at him in amazement. "You know who I am?" "I know exactly who you are," he said, his arms still supporting her as she struggled to regain her footing. "I'm Duke Edward Kensington, and I was on my way to your betrothal celebration when I witnessed your stepmother's attempt to murder you. Duke Kensington, Bela breathed. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone in society had. He was one of the most powerful and influential men in England, known for his intelligence, his integrity, and his complete disdain for the petty machinations of the ton. The question now, Edward continued, his eyes scanning the tower above them, is what we're going to do about it. We? Bela asked. Oh yes, Lady Ashcroft, Edward said, his voice taking on a tone of steely determination. You and I are now bound together by what I've witnessed tonight. I cannot simply walk away and pretend I didn't see attempted murder, and you cannot return to that house knowing your stepmother wants you dead. But the betrothal celebration, Bela said weakly. The guests will have to be told something, Edward agreed. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe while we decide how to proceed. As he helped her toward his waiting carriage, Bela felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. Her life as she had known it was over, that much was certain. But perhaps, with this mysterious Duke's help, she might yet live to see another dawn. Your Grace, she said as he handed her into the carriage, why were you at Ashcroft Manor tonight? You weren't on the guest list. Edward paused, his hand still holding hers. Because, Lady Ashcroft, I had reason to believe that your betrothal was not what it seemed. I came to investigate certain irregularities in Lord Worthington's background. It appears I arrived just in time. As the carriage pulled away from Ashcroft Manor, Bela looked back at the tower window from which she had fallen. In the candlelight, she could see Catherine's silhouette, no doubt wondering why there was no body on the ground below. She'll know I survived, Bela said quietly. Yes, Edward agreed grimly. Which means the real danger is just beginning. Sanctuary and secrets. Edward's London townhouse was a study in understated elegance, from the marble foyer to the richly appointed library where he had installed Bela while they decided what to do next. She sat in a leather chair before the fireplace, wrapped in a warm cloak that one of his servants had provided, trying to process the events of the evening. Drink this, Edward said, pressing a snifter of brandy into her hands. It will help with the shock. Bela accepted the glass gratefully, though her hands were still trembling. I still can't quite believe it happened. My own stepmother tried to murder you for your inheritance, Edward finished grimly. I'm afraid such things are more common than you might think, particularly when large fortunes are at stake. But how did you know? Bela asked, studying his face in the firelight. You said you came to investigate irregularities in Lord Worthington's background. What sort of irregularities? Edward settled into the chair across from her, his steel-grey eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Lord Worthington is not who he claims to be. His title is legitimate, but his fortune is not. He's deeply in debt and has been seeking a wealthy wife to restore his finances. That's hardly unusual, Bela observed. Half the marriages in the ton are financial arrangements. True, Edward agreed, but Worthington's debts are to some very dangerous people. The sort who might resort to violence if they're not repaid. I had reason to believe that marrying you was only the first step in a larger scheme. What sort of scheme? The sort that might involve your convenient death shortly after the wedding, Edward said bluntly. Your inheritance would pass to your husband, who would then be in a position to pay his debts and disappear. Bela felt sick. So both my stepmother and my betrothed wanted me dead. It would appear so, Edward confirmed, though for different reasons. Your stepmother wanted you dead before the marriage, so the inheritance would pass to her son. Worthington wanted you dead after the marriage so he could claim your fortune directly. How do you know all this? Bela asked. Edward was quiet for a moment, as though weighing how much to reveal. Because, Lady Ashcroft, I make it my business to know when members of the ton are in danger. There are more predators in our social circle than you might imagine, and someone needs to watch for them. You make it sound like you're some sort of protector. In a sense, I suppose I am, Edward said. I have resources, connections, and most importantly, I have no need of anyone else's fortune. That makes me uniquely positioned to help those who are being targeted by fortune hunters and worse. Bela studied his face, noting the strong jaw, the intelligent eyes, the way he carried himself with quiet authority. Why do you do it? Help people, I mean. Because someone must, Edward said simply. And because I've seen what happens when predators are allowed to operate unchecked. Personal experience? Bela asked gently. Edward's expression darkened. My sister was murdered by her husband 3 years ago. He married her for her dowry, then arranged for her to have a riding accident once he had access to her funds. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. "I'm so sorry," Bella said softly, understanding now the source of his grim determination. "Her death taught me that evil often wears a respectable face," Edward continued. "Since then, I've made it my mission to identify and stop such predators before they can claim more victims." "And you believe I was to be the next victim?" "I'm certain of it," Edward said. "The question now is what we're going to do about it." Bella set down her brandy glass and looked at him directly. "What are my options?" "Limited, I'm afraid," Edward admitted. "You can't return home. Your stepmother will simply try again, and next time she'll be more careful. You can't marry Worthington, obviously, and you can't simply disappear. Too many people know you're alive. So what do you suggest?" Edward leaned forward, his expression intense. "I suggest we turn the tables on your would-be killers. We let them believe their plans have succeeded, while we gather evidence of their crimes." "How?" "We stage your death," Edward said simply. "Let Catherine believe her plan worked. Let Worthington believe you're dead, and his debts will go unpaid. Meanwhile, you'll be safely hidden while we build a case against them." Bella considered the proposal. "And after we have evidence? Then what?" "Then we expose them publicly and see them face justice," Edward said. "But I won't lie to you, Lady Ashcroft. It will be dangerous. If they discover you're alive before we're ready, they'll stop at nothing to finish what they started. And if I refuse? If I simply want to disappear and start a new life somewhere far from here, then I'll help you do that as well," Edward said without hesitation. "But they'll still be free to target other victims. Your stepmother will inherit your father's estate, and Worthington will find another wealthy bride to marry and murder." Bella was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. Finally, she looked up at Edward with determination in her violet eyes. "What would staging my death involve? We'll need to create evidence of your demise, perhaps a body in the river or signs of a struggle in the woods, something that will satisfy the authorities without requiring them to look too closely." "And where would I hide?" "Here, initially," Edward said. "My household is completely trustworthy, and no one would think to look for you in the home of a duke. Later, if necessary, I have properties in Scotland and Ireland where you could stay safely." "You're asking me to trust you completely," Bella observed, "to put my life entirely in your hands." "I am," Edward agreed, "and I understand if that's too much to ask. We've only just met, and under the most extraordinary circumstances." Bella studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden motive, but all she saw was sincerity, determination, and something else, a genuine concern for her welfare that she had rarely encountered in her life. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why are you willing to risk so much for a stranger?" "Because you're not a stranger," Edward said, his voice soft but intense. "You're a woman in danger, and I have the power to help you. That's all the reason I need. And there's nothing you want in return?" Edward's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something flicker in their depths, an emotion quickly suppressed. "Nothing you're not willing to give freely." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to explore. But Bella felt something stir in her chest, a warmth, a recognition, a sense of possibility that she had never experienced before. "Very well," she said finally. "I accept your proposal, but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, I want to be involved in planning our strategy. I won't simply hide while you handle everything. I want to help bring them to justice." "Agreed," Edward said without hesitation. "Second, I want your word that if at any point I decide this is too dangerous and want to disappear permanently, you'll help me do so without argument." "You have it." "And third," Bella said, her voice taking on a note of steel, "I want to be the one to confront Catherine when we finally expose her. She tried to murder me, and I want her to know that I survived." Edward smiled, and it transformed his entire face. "Lady Ashcroft, I believe you and I are going to work very well together." As they began to plan the details of her staged death, Bella felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in her life, she was making choices based on her own desires rather than others' expectations. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "Edward," she said, using his given name for the first time, "what happens after we expose them? What happens to me?" "That," Edward said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, "will be entirely up to you." But even as he spoke the words, both of them knew that their fates were already becoming intertwined in ways that neither had anticipated. The danger that had brought them together was real and immediate, but so was the attraction growing between them, an attraction that would soon prove as powerful as any threat they faced. The deception begins. 3 days after Bella's supposed death, all of London was buzzing with the tragic news. The body of a young woman, badly damaged by the river and time, had been found downstream from Ashcroft Manor. While identification was difficult, the remnants of a midnight blue gown and sapphire jewellery had been enough to convince the authorities that Lady Bella Ashcroft had indeed taken her own life on the night of her betrothal. From the safety of Edward's townhouse, Bella read the newspaper accounts of her own demise with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. "Listen to this," she said to Edward as they sat in his library. Lady Ashcroft, overwhelmed by the pressures of her upcoming marriage and recent family difficulties, apparently threw herself from the tower of the family estate in a moment of despair. Family difficulties. What a delicate way to describe attempted murder. "The story is serving its purpose," Edward observed, looking up from the correspondence he was reviewing. "Both your stepmother and Worthington appear to believe you're truly dead. How can you be certain?" Edward handed her a letter. "This arrived this morning. It's from Worthington, expressing his condolences and his intention to leave England immediately to recover from his grief in the Mediterranean. Running away to avoid his creditors, more likely," Bella said with disgust. "What about Catherine? According to my sources, she's already begun making arrangements to bring her son back from the continent," Edward replied. "She's also been meeting with lawyers about your father's will." "My poor father," Bella said sadly. "Does he truly believe I'm dead?" "I'm afraid so," Edward said gently. "I considered telling him the truth, but—" "No, you were right not to," Bella interrupted. "He's not strong enough to maintain such a deception, especially if he's as ill as Catherine claims. Better that he believes I'm gone than risk him accidentally revealing that I'm alive." They had spent the past 3 days planning their next moves, while Bella recovered from her ordeal. Edward had provided her with a complete wardrobe, claiming that his late sister's clothes had been preserved and were approximately her size. The gesture had touched Bella deeply, though she suspected the clothes had actually been purchased specifically for her. "There's something else," Edward said, his tone becoming more serious. "I've received information about Worthington's debts that changes our situation considerably." "What sort of information?" "The men he owes money to are not merely dangerous. They're connected to a larger criminal organization that has been targeting wealthy families across England. Worthington was apparently just one of their agents." Bella felt a chill run down her spine. "You're saying this is bigger than just one fortune hunter?" "Much bigger," Edward confirmed. "I believe we've stumbled onto a conspiracy that involves multiple murders, all disguised as accidents or suicides. Your case may be the key to exposing the entire operation." "That's overwhelming," Bella said, sinking back in her chair. "Which is why I need to ask you again if you're certain you want to continue with this," Edward said, moving to kneel beside her chair. "If you'd prefer to simply disappear and start a new life elsewhere, I'll arrange it immediately. You don't owe it to anyone to risk your life further." Bella looked down at him, struck by the genuine concern in his eyes. Over the past 3 days, she had come to appreciate not just his strength and intelligence, but his kindness and integrity. He was unlike any man she had ever known. Powerful, yet gentle. Commanding, yet considerate. "If I disappear," she said slowly, "how many other women will die because we didn't stop this conspiracy?" "That's not your responsibility," Edward said firmly. "Isn't it?" Bella asked. "I'm alive when I should be dead. Doesn't that create some obligation to use that second chance to help others?" Edward studied her face for a long moment. "You're remarkable, do you know that?" "I'm terrified," Bella admitted. "But I'm also angry. They tried to kill me, Edward. They would have succeeded if not for you. I want them to pay for that." "Then we continue," Edward said, rising to his feet. "But we do it carefully, and we do it together." "Together," Bella agreed, and the word sent a warm flutter through her chest. Over the following days, they developed an elaborate plan to infiltrate the criminal organization. Edward would use his connections and resources to investigate the financial aspects of the conspiracy, while Bella would assume a new identity and attempt to gather information from within. "It's too dangerous," Edward protested when Bella first suggested the idea. "If they recognize you—" "They won't," Bella insisted. "I'll alter my appearance, change my manner of speaking, become someone completely different. You said yourself that they target wealthy families. What if I became the perfect bait?" "Absolutely not," Edward said flatly. Think about it, Bella pressed. A young woman, recently orphaned, with a substantial inheritance and no male relatives to protect her. Wouldn't that be exactly the sort of target they'd pursue? It would also be exactly the sort of target they'd kill, Edward pointed out. Not if I'm careful. Not if you're watching out for me. They argued about it for hours, but eventually Edward was forced to admit that Bella's plan had merit. With the right preparation and safeguards, it might be possible for her to infiltrate the organization and gather the evidence they needed. But we do this my way, Edward insisted, with my people watching you at all times, with predetermined signals for when you need help, and with an escape plan that we can implement at a moment's notice. Agreed, Bella said, though privately she was determined to see the mission through regardless of the danger. The transformation began immediately. Edward brought in a theatrical costumer who helped Bella alter her appearance dramatically. Her lustrous black hair was cut and dyed to a mousy brown. Her violet eyes were hidden behind spectacles, and her naturally pale complexion was given a sallow cast with careful makeup. Padding changed her figure, and new mannerisms altered her entire bearing. "I don't recognize you," Edward said with amazement when the transformation was complete. "You've become someone entirely different." "Miss Eleanor Hartwell," Bella said, adopting the accent and mannerisms they had practiced. "Recently orphaned, recently wealthy, and completely naive about the dangers of London society. And completely irresistible to fortune hunters," Edward added grimly. They had created an elaborate backstory for Eleanor Hartwell, the daughter of a successful merchant who had died suddenly, leaving her a substantial inheritance and no family to guide her. She would be new to London, eager to enter society, and vulnerable to the sort of predators they were hunting. "Remember," Edward said as they prepared for her first public appearance as Eleanor, "you're not Bella Ashcroft anymore. You're a different person with a different history. Don't let your emotions about what happened to you interfere with the role you're playing." "I understand," Bella said, though privately she wondered if she could truly maintain such a deception. "And remember that I'll be watching," Edward continued. "If anything goes wrong, if you feel threatened in any way, you give the signal and we extract you immediately." "What if the signal puts you in danger?" Bella asked. "That's not your concern," Edward said firmly. "Your safety is my priority, not my own." The intensity in his voice made Bella look at him sharply. Over the past week, she had begun to suspect that his feelings for her went beyond mere protectiveness, just as her own feelings for him had evolved beyond gratitude, but neither of them had spoken of it directly. "Edward," she said softly, "what happens between us when this is over?" "What do you want to happen?" he asked, his steel-grey eyes searching her face. "I don't know," Bella admitted. "Everything has happened so quickly, under such extraordinary circumstances. I can't tell what's real and what's just proximity and danger." "I can tell you what's real for me," Edward said, stepping closer to her. "My feelings for you have nothing to do with proximity or danger. They have to do with your courage, your intelligence, your determination to see justice done even at great personal risk." "Edward," Bella began, but he continued. "I know this isn't the time or place for such declarations," he said. "I know we have more pressing concerns, but I needed you to know that whatever happens in the coming days, my feelings for you are genuine." Before Bella could respond, he leaned down and kissed her gently, a kiss that spoke of tenderness and longing and promises for the future. When they broke apart, Bella felt as though the world had shifted on its axis. "Now," Edward said, his voice slightly unsteady, "let's go catch some criminals." As they prepared to leave for Bella's first appearance as Eleanor Hartwell, both knew that they were embarking on more than just a dangerous mission. They were beginning a journey that would test not only their courage and cunning, but the growing love between them, a love that had been born in darkness and danger, but might yet flourish in the light of truth and justice. The trap is set. Lady Pemberton's weekly salon was considered one of the most important social gatherings in London, attracting everyone from ambitious fortune hunters to bored aristocrats seeking entertainment. It was the perfect venue for Eleanor Hartwell to make her debut in society, and for the predators to notice their new prey. Bella, transformed beyond recognition in her Eleanor disguise, entered the elegant drawing room with carefully practiced nervousness. She wore a modest but expensive gown that suggested wealth without ostentation, and her altered appearance made her seem younger and more vulnerable than her true age. "Miss Hartwell," Lady Pemberton exclaimed, sweeping forward to greet her new guest. "How delightful to finally meet you." I've heard such interesting things about your recent arrival in London. Thank you for receiving me, Lady Pemberton, Bella replied in Eleanor's softer, more hesitant voice. I'm afraid I know so few people in London. My dear father kept me quite sheltered in the country. Of course he did, the dear man, Lady Pemberton said, with the sort of false sympathy that Bella had learned to recognize among the ton. And now you're all alone in the world, poor child. But don't worry. We'll soon have you properly introduced to society. As Lady Pemberton led her through the room, Bella was acutely aware of the attention she was attracting. Several gentlemen had already begun to take notice of the newcomer, and she could practically see them calculating her potential worth. Miss Hartwell, Lady Pemberton said, stopping before a group of elegantly dressed people. Allow me to present Lord and Lady Blackwood, Mr. Fitzpatrick, and she paused as another gentleman approached. Ah, perfect timing. This is Lord Worthington, recently returned from the continent. Bella felt her blood freeze as she found herself face to face with the man who had planned to marry and murder her. Worthington looked exactly as she remembered. Handsome in a dissolute way, with fair hair and blue eyes that seemed charming until you looked closely enough to see the coldness beneath. Miss Hartwell, Worthington said, bowing over her hand with practiced gallantry. What a pleasure to meet you. I don't believe I've had the honor of your acquaintance. No, my lord, Bella replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. I've only recently come to London from Derbyshire. Derbyshire, Worthington repeated with obvious interest. Beautiful country. And what brings you to London, if I may ask? My father passed away recently, Bella said, allowing a tremor to enter her voice. I find myself quite alone in the world, and my solicitors suggested that London society might provide guidance for a young woman in my position. She saw the predatory gleam that flashed in Worthington's eyes at the mention of her supposed orphaned state. He was already calculating her potential value, just as he had with her true identity. How tragic for you, he said with false sympathy, but also how fortunate for London society to gain such a charming addition. I hope you'll allow me to call upon you soon. Perhaps I could show you some of the city's attractions. That would be very kind, Bella replied, though inwardly she was fighting the urge to expose him on the spot. As the evening progressed, Bella found herself surrounded by potential suitors, each more transparently mercenary than the last. But it was Worthington who remained most persistent, and by the end of the evening he had secured permission to escort her to the theatre the following week. You were magnificent, Edward said when she returned to his townhouse later that evening. I watched the entire performance, and you never broke character once. It was harder than I expected, Bella admitted, sinking into a chair and rubbing her temples. Seeing Worthington again, having to smile and be charming while he calculated my worth, it took everything I had not to slap him. But you didn't, and that's what matters, Edward said, moving to pour her a glass of wine. Did you learn anything useful? Several things, Bella replied, accepting the wine gratefully. First, Worthington is definitely still in London, despite his supposed grief over my death. Second, he's clearly in need of funds. His clothes are expensive but not new, and I noticed him eyeing the jewelry of every woman in the room. And third, he's already planning to court Eleanor Hartwell with the same methods he used on Bella Ashcroft. Which means our trap is working, Edward observed with satisfaction. It also means I'll have to spend considerable time in his company, Bella said with a shudder. I'm not sure how long I can maintain the pretense of finding him charming. You won't have to maintain it for long, Edward assured her. We just need enough time to gather evidence of his criminal activities and identify his associates. Speaking of associates, Bella said, I noticed several other gentlemen who seemed to be working in coordination with Worthington. They would approach potential targets, engage them in conversation, and then somehow steer them toward Worthington for introduction. A systematic operation, Edward said grimly, just as I suspected. Over the following weeks, Bella continued her masquerade as Eleanor Hartwell, attending social events and allowing Worthington to court her with increasing intensity. Each encounter provided new insights into the criminal organization's methods, but also increased the danger to herself. He's becoming more aggressive, she reported to Edward after a particularly uncomfortable evening at the opera. Tonight, he suggested that we should consider a more intimate relationship. He's clearly trying to compromise me in some way. Then we need to move faster, Edward said, his jaw tightening with anger. I won't have you subjected to his advances any longer than necessary. I can handle Worthington, Bella insisted, but there's something else. I think I've identified the leader of their organization. Who? Lady Pemberton herself, Bella said. I've been watching the patterns of introduction and conversation at her salons, and she's orchestrating everything. She identifies the targets, arranges the introductions, and even provides alibis when necessary. Edward stared at her in amazement. Lady Pemberton. But she's one of the most respected hostesses in London, which makes her the perfect cover, Bela pointed out. Who would suspect a society matron of running a criminal enterprise? She has access to information about everyone's financial situation. She can arrange meetings without suspicion, and her word carries enough weight to influence investigations. If you're right, this is even bigger than we thought, Edward said. Lady Pemberton's connections reach into the highest levels of government and society, which is why we need irrefutable evidence before we make any accusations, Bela said. And I think I know how to get it. How? Worthington has invited me to a private dinner party next week, Bela said. He claims it's to introduce me to some of his closest friends, but I suspect it's actually a meeting of the organization's inner circle. If I can attend and somehow record what's discussed. Absolutely not, Edward said immediately. It's too dangerous. If they suspect you're not who you claim to be, they won't, Bela interrupted. I've been playing Eleanor Hartwell for weeks now. They believe in her completely. But a private dinner party, away from public scrutiny. If something goes wrong, I won't be able to help you. Then we'll have to make sure nothing goes wrong, Bela said firmly. Edward, this may be our only chance to get the evidence we need. We can't let it pass by. They argued about it for hours, but eventually Edward was forced to admit that Bela was right. The dinner party represented their best opportunity to gather concrete evidence of the conspiracy. But we do this with every possible precaution, he insisted. You'll wear a device that allows me to hear everything that's said, you'll have a predetermined escape route, and at the first sign of danger, you leave immediately. Agreed, Bela said, though privately she was determined to see the mission through regardless of the personal risk. As they prepared for what might be the most dangerous night of their investigation, both Bela and Edward were acutely aware that they were gambling with more than just their mission's success. They were gambling with their lives, their future, and the love that had grown between them in the shadows of conspiracy and danger. Promise me something, Edward said as they finalized their plans. What? Promise me that if this goes wrong, if you're discovered, you'll think of yourself first, he said, his steel-grey eyes intense with emotion. Don't try to be a hero. Just survive and come back to me. I promise, Bela said softly, if you promise me the same thing. I promise, Edward replied, though they both knew that when the moment came, they would risk everything to protect each other. The trap was set, the players were in position, and the final act of their dangerous game was about to begin. But as Bela prepared to enter the lion's den, she carried with her not just the hope of justice for herself and other victims, but the knowledge that whatever happened, she had found something worth fighting for, a love that had transformed her from a victim into a warrior. The revelation. The dinner party was held at Worthington's rented townhouse in Mayfair, a location that immediately put Bela on edge. Away from the public venues where she had previously encountered him, she felt exposed and vulnerable despite the hidden listening device Edward had provided. Miss Hartwell, Worthington greeted her at the door with his practiced charm. You look absolutely radiant this evening. Thank you, Lord Worthington, Bela replied in Eleanor's soft voice, though she noticed his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. I'm so looking forward to meeting your friends. And they're eager to meet you, Worthington said, offering his arm. I've told them so much about your circumstances. The drawing room contained 6 other guests, and Bela recognized several of them from Lady Pemberton's salons. But it was the presence of Lady Pemberton herself that confirmed her suspicions about the true nature of this gathering. Eleanor, my dear, Lady Pemberton said, rising to greet her with false warmth, how lovely to see you again. I trust you're settling well into London society. Very well, thank you, Bela replied, though she was studying the other guests carefully. They were an eclectic group. Some titled, some wealthy merchants, some whose backgrounds were unclear, but they all shared a certain predatory quality that set her nerves on edge. Shall we go in to dinner? Worthington suggested, and Bela found herself seated between him and a gentleman introduced as Mr. Blackthorne, whose cold eyes and calculating manner reminded her uncomfortably of her stepmother. The conversation during the first course was innocuous enough. Discussion of the weather, recent social events, and London's theatrical offerings. But as the wine flowed and the servants were dismissed, the tone began to shift. Now then, Lady Pemberton said, her voice taking on a business-like quality that was completely different from her usual social manner. Let's discuss our current projects. Bela felt her pulse quicken as she realized she was about to witness exactly what she had hoped for, a meeting of the criminal organization's leadership. The Ashcroft matter concluded successfully, Worthington reported with satisfaction. The girl's death was accepted without question, and the inheritance will pass to the stepmother's son within the month. Excellent, Lady Pemberton said. And our investment in that particular scheme will be repaid with interest once the estate is settled, Worthington confirmed. Lady Catherine has been most cooperative. Bela fought to keep her expression neutral as she listened to them discuss her supposed death as a successful business transaction. The casual cruelty of it was almost overwhelming. What about the Hartwell opportunity? Mr. Blackthorne asked, his cold eyes fixing on Bela. Have we made sufficient progress there? Miss Hartwell has proven most receptive to my attentions, Worthington said, with a smile that made Bela's stomach turn. I believe we can move to the next phase soon. What exactly does the next phase involve? Bela asked, trying to sound like an innocent young woman curious about business matters she didn't understand. The table fell silent, and Bela realized she had made a mistake. Eleanor Hartwell wouldn't ask such direct questions about matters that didn't concern her. My dear Miss Hartwell, Lady Pemberton said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, surely such boring business talk must be tedious for you. Perhaps you'd prefer to discuss something more suitable for a young lady. Of course, Bela said quickly. I apologize for my curiosity. It's just that I've never been exposed to business discussions before. Naturally not, Worthington said, though she noticed he was studying her more carefully now. Such matters are hardly appropriate for delicate feminine minds. The conversation moved on, but Bela could feel the shift in atmosphere. Several of the guests were now watching her with increased attention, and she began to worry that her disguise might not be as perfect as she had believed. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, Mr. Blackthorne said suddenly, what was your father's business exactly? You mentioned he was a merchant, but you've been rather vague about the details. Bela's mind raced as she tried to remember the backstory she and Edward had created. He dealt in textiles, she said carefully, importing fine fabrics from the continent. How interesting, Blackthorne continued. I have some connections in that trade myself. Which ports did he primarily use? The question was clearly a test, and Bela realized with growing alarm that she was being interrogated. I'm afraid I don't know the specifics, she said, allowing a note of confusion to enter her voice. Father never discussed such details with me. Of course not, Lady Pemberton said smoothly. How thoughtless of us to burden you with such questions. But tell me, my dear, have you given any thought to your future? A young woman alone in the world must consider her options carefully. I'm not sure what you mean, Bela replied, though she was beginning to understand that this dinner party was more than just a social gathering. It was an evaluation. Marriage, of course, Lady Pemberton said with false brightness. A woman in your position needs the protection and guidance of a husband. Lord Worthington, for instance, would make an excellent match for someone in Miss Hartwell's circumstances. Indeed I would, Worthington agreed, his hand suddenly covering Bela's on the table. I've grown quite fond of our Eleanor, and I believe we could be very happy together. Bela felt trapped as the conversation continued around her, with the group discussing her future as though she were a commodity to be traded. But it was when Lady Pemberton began outlining the specific terms of a potential marriage contract that Bela realized the true horror of their operation. The arrangement would be quite simple, Lady Pemberton explained. A quick courtship, a private ceremony, and then a honeymoon voyage to the continent. Such a romantic notion, don't you think? Very romantic, Bela agreed weakly, understanding now that the honeymoon voyage would be when they planned to dispose of Eleanor Hartwell, just as they had planned to dispose of Bela Ashcroft. And of course, Worthington added, I would be honored to manage Eleanor's inheritance on her behalf. Women shouldn't be burdened with such complex financial matters. How thoughtful, Bela said, though inwardly she was fighting the urge to expose them all on the spot. But as the evening progressed, she began to notice something troubling. Several of the guests were asking increasingly specific questions about her background, her family, and her circumstances. It was as though they were testing her story against information they already possessed. Miss Hartwell, Mr. Blackthorne said during dessert, I've been thinking about your father's textile business. I believe I may have known him, a Mr. Jonathan Hartwell of Derbyshire. Bela's blood ran cold. There was no Jonathan Hartwell of Derbyshire. They had invented the entire identity. But Blackthorne's question suggested they had been investigating Eleanor's background and had discovered the deception. Yes, that was my father, she said carefully, though she could feel the trap closing around her. How strange, Blackthorne continued with a cold smile. Because, according to my sources, Jonathan Hartwell died 15 years ago, and he had no children. The silence that followed was deafening. Baylor felt every eye in the room fixed on her, as the truth of her deception became clear. Well, Lady Pemberton said softly, it seems we have an impostor among us. The question is, who are you really, my dear? Baylor's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out of the situation. She could feel the listening device against her skin and knew that Edward was hearing everything, but he was too far away to help her immediately. I don't know what you mean, she said, trying to maintain Eleanor's innocent manner. There must be some mistake. The mistake, Worthington interrupted, his charming facade dropping away to reveal the predator beneath, was thinking you could deceive us. We've been investigating your background since our first meeting, Miss, whoever you are. The real question, Lady Pemberton added, is whether you're working alone or if someone sent you to spy on us. Bella realized that her only chance was to brazen it out and hope that Edward would arrive soon. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said, rising from her chair. If you're going to make wild accusations, I think I should leave. But as she moved toward the door, two of the male guests blocked her path, their intentions clearly hostile. I'm afraid we can't allow that, Worthington said, also rising. You see, we have a very successful operation here, and we can't risk exposure. Whether you're a government agent, a private investigator, or simply someone seeking revenge, you've seen too much to be allowed to leave. You're making a terrible mistake, Baylor said, backing away from the advancing men. I'm exactly who I said I am. No, came a new voice from the doorway. She's Lady Bella Ashcroft, and she's supposed to be dead. Baylor spun around to see her stepmother, Catherine, entering the room with a triumphant smile. The sight of the woman who had tried to murder her sent a shock of terror and rage through Baylor's system. Catherine, she breathed, dropping all pretense of being Eleanor Hartwell. Hello, my dear stepdaughter, Catherine said with mock affection. Imagine my surprise when Lord Worthington described his new conquest, and I recognized the description despite your alterations. You knew, Bella said, understanding flooding through her. You've known all along that I survived. I suspected, Catherine confirmed. When no body was found immediately, I began to wonder, and when reports of your death were so conveniently vague, I became certain. You always were too clever for your own good, Baylor. So you've been working with them all along, Bella said, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. Working with them, Catherine laughed. My dear child, I am them. This entire organization was my creation, designed to eliminate inconvenient heirs and redistribute their wealth to more deserving parties. The revelation hit Bella like a physical blow. Her stepmother wasn't just a murderer. She was the mastermind behind a conspiracy that had killed dozens of people. You're insane, Bella whispered. I'm practical, Catherine corrected. And now, my dear, it's time to finish what I started on that tower. But even as Catherine spoke, the sound of breaking glass came from the front of the house, followed by shouts and the thunder of running feet. Edward had arrived, and he had brought help. It seems your rescue has arrived, Lady Pemberton observed with remarkable calm. How inconvenient. Not rescue, Bella said, her voice growing stronger as she heard Edward's voice commanding the authorities in the hallway. Justice. The door burst open as Edward stormed into the dining room, followed by several constables and a man Bella didn't recognize, but who carried himself with obvious authority. Nobody move, Edward commanded, his steel-grey eyes sweeping the room before fixing on Baylor with visible relief. Lady Ashcroft, are you harmed? I'm unharmed, Bella replied, though her voice shook with emotion at seeing him. But they know everything, Edward. They've known who I was from the beginning. Not from the beginning, Catherine corrected with cold amusement, but certainly for the past week. Did you really think you could investigate us without us investigating you in return? Lady Catherine Ashcroft, the authoritative stranger said, stepping forward. I am Inspector Morrison of Scotland Yard. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and numerous other charges. On what evidence? Catherine asked, though her composure was beginning to crack. On the evidence provided by your stepdaughter's testimony, corroborated by the listening device she wore tonight, Inspector Morrison replied. We have recordings of your entire conversation, including your confession to orchestrating multiple murders. The room erupted in chaos as several of the guests attempted to flee, but the constables were ready for them. Worthington made a desperate lunge for a window, but Edward intercepted him with a blow that sent him crashing to the floor. That, Edward said grimly, is for planning to murder the woman I love. In the midst of the arrests and shouting, Bella found herself face to face with Catherine one final time. "You think you've won," Catherine said, her mask of civility finally dropping completely. "But you'll never be safe. There are others, Bella, others who will finish what I started." "Then they'll have to go through me," Edward said, moving to stand protectively beside Bella. "And I promise you that won't be easy." "How touching," Catherine sneered as the constables moved to arrest her. "But love won't protect you from what's coming." As Catherine was led away in shackles, Bella felt a mixture of triumph and exhaustion wash over her. The woman who had tried to murder her was finally facing justice, but the cost of achieving it had been enormous. "It's over," Edward said softly, pulling her into his arms. "You're safe now." "Is it really over?" Bella asked, looking around at the chaos of the arrests. Catherine said there were others. "There may be," Edward admitted, "but the core of the organization has been destroyed. Lady Pemberton, Worthington and the others will face trial, and their testimony will help us identify any remaining conspirators." Inspector Morrison approached them as the last of the criminals was led away. "Lady Ashcroft, I want to commend you on your courage tonight. Without your testimony and the evidence you gathered, we never could have broken this conspiracy." "What will happen to them?" Bella asked. "They'll face trial for multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy," Morrison replied. "The evidence is overwhelming thanks to your work. I expect they'll all face the gallows." The thought should have brought Bella satisfaction, but instead she felt only a profound weariness. "And my father? Does he need to know that I'm alive?" "That's your decision," Morrison said gently. "But given his condition, you may want to consider whether the shock would be beneficial or harmful." As they left Worthington's townhouse and returned to Edward's residence, Bella found herself struggling with the enormity of what had happened. Her life as she had known it was over. She could never again be simply Lady Bella Ashcroft, the sheltered daughter of a nobleman. But what would she become instead? "You're very quiet," Edward observed as they sat in his library, sharing a brandy to calm their nerves. "I'm trying to understand what happens now," Bella said. "Officially, I'm dead. My father believes I'm dead. Even if we reveal the truth, I can never go back to my old life. Would you want to?" Edward asked gently. Bella considered the question. "No," she said finally. "That life was never really mine. It was a role I was expected to play, but I'm not sure what life I want instead." "I know what life I want," Edward said, setting down his brandy and moving to kneel beside her chair. "I want a life with you, Bella, not as Lady Ashcroft or Miss Hartwell or any other identity you might assume. I want you as yourself, brave, intelligent, passionate, real." "Edward," Bella began, but he continued. "I know the circumstances of our meeting were extraordinary," he said. "I know we've been through trauma and danger together, and that might complicate our feelings. But I also know that what I feel for you goes beyond gratitude or proximity or shared adventure. I love you, Bella, completely and irrevocably." "I love you too," Bella said softly, reaching out to touch his face. "But are you certain? I come with no dowry now, no family connections, no social standing. I'm essentially a woman without a past." "You're a woman with a future," Edward corrected. "Our future, if you'll have me." "What are you asking?" "I'm asking you to marry me," Edward said simply. "Not for political alliance or financial gain, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Bella felt tears gathering in her eyes as she looked at this remarkable man who had saved her life and shown her what true love could be. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." When Edward kissed her this time, it was with the passion and promise of a man claiming his bride, and Bella responded with all the love and gratitude in her heart. They had found each other in the darkest of circumstances, but their love had proven stronger than danger, deception, and death itself. New beginnings. 6 months later, Bella stood in the garden of Edward's country estate, watching the sun set over the rolling hills of Yorkshire. She wore a simple gown of cream silk, and her hair, now returned to its natural raven black, fell in loose waves around her shoulders. She was no longer Lady Bella Ashcroft or Miss Eleanor Hartwell, but simply Mrs. Edward Kensington, and she had never been happier. "Admiring the view?" Edward asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Admiring our life," Bella replied, leaning back against his chest. "6 months ago, I thought my story was ending. Now I feel like it's just beginning." "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Edward asked gently. Tomorrow marked the beginning of the trials for Catherine, Lady Pemberton, Worthington, and the other members of the conspiracy. Bella would be the key witness, and she knew it would be difficult to relive those events in a public courtroom. "Ready," she said firmly. "They need to face justice for what they did, not just to me, but to all their victims." The investigation had revealed the true scope of the conspiracy, at least 23 suspicious deaths over the past 5 years, all wealthy individuals who had died under circumstances that benefited their supposed loved ones. Catherine's organization had been responsible for an epidemic of murder disguised as suicide, accident, and natural death. "Inspector Morrison believes your testimony will be enough to convict them all," Edward said. "Good," Bella replied. "But even more importantly, it will prevent them from claiming future victims." They had spent the past months not just planning their wedding and adjusting to married life, but also working with the authorities to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. Bella's courage in testifying had encouraged other survivors to come forward, and the evidence against the criminals had become overwhelming. "There's something else," Edward said, his tone becoming more serious. "I received a letter today from your father's physician." Bella tensed. They had decided not to reveal her survival to her father, believing that the shock might worsen his already fragile condition. But she had asked for regular reports on his health. "How is he?" she asked. "Improving, actually," Edward said with surprise. "The physician says that Catherine's arrest and the revelation of her crimes seems to have lifted a great weight from his mind. He's been asking questions about your death, expressing doubts about the official story. Do you think he suspects the truth?" "I think he hopes for it," Edward said carefully. "The question is whether we should tell him." Bella was quiet for a long moment, considering. "After the trials," she said finally, "once Catherine and the others are convicted and can no longer threaten him, I'd like to see him. I'd like him to know that I survived, that I'm happy, that I found love. And if he wants you to reclaim your identity as Lady Ashcroft, then I'll explain that Lady Ashcroft died in that tower," Bella said. "What survived was something stronger, something real. I'm not the same person who was pushed from that window, Edward. I'm someone new, someone better." "You're the woman I fell in love with," Edward said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Brave, intelligent, compassionate, and absolutely unstoppable when you set your mind to something." Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the arrival of a carriage bearing the distinctive crest of the Duke of Wellington. Edward frowned as he recognized the vehicle. "Were you expecting visitors?" Bella asked. "No," Edward replied, his expression growing serious. "But if Wellington is here personally, it must be important." They made their way to the house as the Duke of Wellington himself emerged from the carriage, his bearing as commanding as ever, despite his advancing years. "Your Grace," Edward said, bowing respectfully. "This is an unexpected honor." "Kensington," Wellington replied with a nod. "And this must be the remarkable Mrs. Kensington I've heard so much about." "Your Grace," Bella said, curtsying gracefully. "I've come to personally thank you both for your service to the Crown," Wellington continued, as they moved into the drawing room. "The conspiracy you uncovered and destroyed represented a significant threat to the stability of our society." "We only did what was necessary," Bella said modestly. "You did far more than that," Wellington corrected. "You risked your lives to protect others, and you succeeded in dismantling an organization that had operated with impunity for years. The Crown is in your debt." "What can we do for you, Your Grace?" Edward asked, sensing there was more to this visit than simple gratitude. "I have a proposition," Wellington said, his eyes moving between them. "The government has need of individuals with your particular skills and courage. There are other threats, other conspiracies that require investigation. Would you consider working for the Crown in an official capacity?" Bella and Edward exchanged glances, both understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. "What sort of work?" Edward asked. "The sort that would allow you to continue protecting innocent people from predators," Wellington replied. "The sort that would give meaning and purpose to the skills you've developed. You would have the full resources of the government at your disposal, and you would be serving your country in the most vital way possible." "We would work together?" Bella asked. "Absolutely," Wellington confirmed. "Your partnership has proven remarkably effective. We would be fools to separate you." Bella felt a thrill of excitement at the prospect. The idea of continuing to fight injustice, of using her experience to help others, appealed to her deeply. "We'll need time to consider," Edward said carefully. "Of course," Wellington agreed, "but don't take too long. There are already cases waiting that could benefit from your attention." After Wellington departed, Bella and Edward sat in their library discussing the unexpected offer. "What do you think?" Edward asked. "I think it sounds perfect," Bella replied without hesitation. "We've proven that we work well together, that we can face danger and emerge victorious. Why shouldn't we use those abilities to help others?" "It would mean more danger, more deception, more time spent in the shadows," Edward warned. "It would also mean more lives saved, more criminals brought to justice, more families protected from predators," Bela countered. "Edward, I've spent my entire life being protected, sheltered, kept safe. But I've discovered that I'm stronger than anyone believed, including myself. I don't want to go back to being a passive observer of life. And I don't want to go back to working alone," Edward admitted. "Having you as my partner has made me more effective, more focused, more determined to succeed." "Then we accept?" Bela asked. "We accept," Edward confirmed, pulling her into his arms. "But first, we finish what we started. We see Catherine and her associates convicted, and we make sure they can never hurt anyone again." "Agreed," Bela said, then smiled mischievously. "And then, we begin our new career as the most unconventional investigators in England." "The most effective investigators in England," Edward corrected, kissing her soundly. As they held each other in the firelight, both reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save a life had become something far greater, a partnership, a love story, and now a mission to protect others from the kind of evil they had faced and defeated. Bela thought of the frightened young woman who had fallen from that tower window, believing her life was over. That woman could never have imagined the strength she would discover, the love she would find, or the purpose that would give meaning to her survival. "Thank you," she whispered to Edward. "For what?" "For catching me," Bela said simply. "For saving my life, for showing me who I could become, for loving me enough to let me be dangerous." "Thank you," Edward replied, "for being worth catching, for being brave enough to fight back, for trusting me with your heart, for making me believe in love again." As they prepared for bed that night, both knew that their greatest adventures still lay ahead. They had found each other in darkness and danger, but they would face the future together in light and love, ready to protect the innocent and fight for justice wherever it was needed. The woman who had been pushed from a tower had indeed died that night, but from her ashes had risen someone far stronger, someone who would spend her life ensuring that no one else would suffer as she had suffered. And beside her would stand the man who had caught her when she fell, who had helped her discover her own strength, and who would love her through whatever dangers they might face. Together, they were unstoppable. Justice and love triumphant. 1 year later, Bela stood in the witness box of the Old Bailey, her voice clear and strong as she delivered the final testimony that would seal Catherine's fate. The courtroom was packed with spectators who had followed the sensational trial, but Bela's eyes were fixed on the jury as she recounted the events of that terrible night. "Lady Catherine Ashcroft pushed me from the tower window with the full intention of murdering me for my inheritance," she said, her voice never wavering. She confessed to orchestrating similar murders of at least 23 other victims. She showed no remorse then, and she has shown none throughout this trial. When the jury returned their verdict of guilty on all charges, the courtroom erupted in cheers. Catherine, Lady Pemberton, Worthington, and their associates would all face the gallows for their crimes. Justice had finally been served. "How does it feel?" Edward asked, as they left the courthouse together. "Like closure," Bela replied. "Like the final chapter of my old life has been written, and now we can focus entirely on our new one." Their new life had indeed begun in earnest. Working for the Crown, they had already solved 3 major cases, saving dozens of lives and bringing numerous criminals to justice. Their partnership had proven even more effective than Wellington had hoped, and they had earned reputations as the most formidable investigative team in England. "Mrs. Kensington," came a familiar voice behind them, and they turned to see Inspector Morrison approaching with a smile. "Excellent testimony today. That should be the end of the Ashcroft conspiracy once and for all." "Thank you, Inspector," Bela replied. "And thank you for believing in us from the beginning." "How could I not?" Morrison asked with amusement. "A woman brave enough to infiltrate a criminal organization, and a duke willing to risk everything to protect her. You are obviously destined for great things." As they made their way home through the London streets, Bela reflected on how much her life had changed. She was no longer the sheltered, naive young woman who had once believed her greatest accomplishment would be making an advantageous marriage. She had become someone who fought for justice, who protected the innocent, who made a real difference in the world. Any regrets? Edward asked, as though reading her thoughts. Only one, Bela said with a smile. I regret that it took nearly dying for me to discover who I really was. And who are you really? Edward asked, though he already knew the answer. I'm a woman who refuses to be a victim, Bela said firmly. I'm someone who fights back, who protects others, who never gives up. I'm your partner in every sense of the word, and I'm exactly who I was meant to be. And I love every fierce, brave, unstoppable inch of you, Edward said, pulling her close for a kiss that drew amused looks from passers-by. That evening, as they sat in their library planning their next case, Bela received an unexpected visitor. Her father, Lord Ashcroft, had come to London for the trial's conclusion, and he had requested a private meeting. My dear daughter, he said as she entered the drawing room, his eyes filling with tears at the sight of her. When I heard you were alive, when I learned the truth about Catherine, I thought my heart would burst with joy and rage in equal measure. Papa, Bela said softly, embracing him gently. His health had improved dramatically since Catherine's arrest, but he was still frail. Can you ever forgive me? He asked. For not seeing what she was? For not protecting you? For believing you were dead when I should have known better? There's nothing to forgive, Bela assured him. Catherine was very skilled at deception. She fooled everyone, including me, for many years. But you survived, Lord Ashcroft said with obvious pride. You not only survived, you fought back and brought her to justice. You've become everything I could have hoped for in a daughter and more. I've become myself, Bela said simply, finally and completely. And you're happy? Her father asked, looking at Edward with obvious approval. Truly happy? Happier than I ever imagined possible, Bela confirmed. I've found my purpose, Papa. I'm helping people, making a difference, using my experiences to protect others from what I went through. Then I'm proud of you, Lord Ashcroft said, prouder than words can express. As her father prepared to return to the country estate that would now be hers to inherit, Bela felt a sense of completion. The past had been resolved, justice had been served, and the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. What's our next case? She asked Edward, as they settled in for the evening. A missing heiress in Scotland, Edward replied, showing her the file Wellington had delivered that afternoon. Disappeared on her wedding day under suspicious circumstances. Sounds familiar, Bela said with dark humor. When do we leave? Tomorrow, if you're ready. I'm ready, Bela said without hesitation. I'm always ready to help someone who might be facing what I faced. As they prepared for bed that night, both reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun with attempted murder had led to true love, meaningful work, and a partnership that made them both stronger than they could ever be alone. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been there that night? Edward asked as they lay in each other's arms. No, Bela said firmly, because you were there. You caught me when I fell, you helped me discover my strength, and you loved me enough to let me become who I was meant to be. That's not chance, Edward. That's destiny. Then I'm grateful for destiny, Edward said, holding her close. So am I, Bela replied. Because it gave me you, it gave me purpose, and it gave me a second chance at life that I'm determined not to waste. As they drifted off to sleep, both carried with them the knowledge that their love story was far from over. They had many more cases to solve, many more lives to save, and many more years to love each other through whatever dangers and adventures awaited them. The woman who had been pushed from a tower had indeed died that night, but from her death had been born someone far more powerful, someone who would spend her life ensuring that justice prevailed and love triumphed over evil. And beside her would always stand the man who had caught her when she fell, who had helped her rise stronger than before, and who would love her through whatever challenges they might face. Together, they were proof that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures, and that true love really can conquer all. Bela's transformation from victim to victor reminds us that our darkest moments often contain the seeds of our greatest triumphs. When she was pushed from that tower, it seemed like the end of her story, but it was actually the beginning of her real life. Her journey teaches us that we are stronger than we know, braver than we believe, and more capable of change than we imagine. Sometimes we need to fall before we can truly learn to fly, and sometimes we need to lose everything before we can discover what really matters. May Bela and Edward's love story inspire you to believe that rescue can come from unexpected places, that love can bloom in the darkest circumstances, and that every ending is really just a new beginning waiting to unfold. Subscribe for more captivating historical romances where love conquers danger and heroes save the day. Discover stories that prove true love is worth fighting for. Comment. What moment in Bella's transformation inspired you most? Your next heart-pounding romance adventure awaits.